Chapter 19 of The Return by Walter de la Mare. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Corinna Schultz. Herbert himself went down to order the governess cart, and packed them in with a rug. And in the dusk Grisel set Lawford down at the corner of his road and drove on to an old bookseller's with a commission from her brother, promising to return for him in an hour. Dust and a few straws lay at rest, as if in some abstruse arrangement on the stones of the porch, just as the last faint whirling gust of sunset had left them. Shut lids of sightless indifference seemed to greet the wanderer from the curtained windows. He opened the door and went in. For a moment he stood in the vacant hall, then he peeped first into the blind-drawn dining room, faintly, dingily sweet, like an empty wine bottle. He went softly on a few paces, and just opening the door looked in on the faintly glittering twilight of the drawing-room. But the congealed stump of candle that he had set in the corner as a final rancorous challenge to the beaten shade was gone. He slowly and deliberately ascended the stairs, conscious of a peculiar sense of ownership of what, in even so brief an absence, had taken on so queer a look of strangeness. It was almost as if he might be some lone heir, come in the rather mournful dusk to view what melancholy fate had unexpectedly bestowed on him. Work in. What on earth else could this chill sense of strangeness mean? Would he ever free his memory from that one haphazard haunting hint? And as he stood in the doorway of the big calm room, which seemed even now to be stirring with the restless shadow of these last few faraway days, now pacing sullenly to and fro, now sitting hunched up to think, and now lying impotent in a vain hopeless endeavour only for the breath of a moment to forget, he awoke out of reverie to find himself smiling at the thought that a changed face was practically at the mercy of an incredulous world, whereas a changed heart was no one's deadly dull affair but its owner's. The merest breath of pity even stole over him for the Sabathier who, after all, had dared and had needed, perhaps, nothing like so arrogant and merciless a coup de grace to realize that he had so ignominiously failed. 'But there, that's done,' he exclaimed out loud, not without a tinge of regret that theories, however brilliant and bizarre, could never now be anything else. That now indeed that the symptoms had gone, the malady, for all who had not been actually admitted into the shocked circle, was becoming nothing more than an inanely tall story, stuffing not even savoury enough for a goose. How wide exactly, he wondered, would Sheila's discreet, shocked circle prove? He stood once more before the looking-glass, hearing again Grisel's words in the still green shadow of the beech tree. Except, of course, horribly, horribly ill. What a fool, what a coward she thinks I am. There was still nearly an hour to be spent in this great barn of faded interests. He lit a candle and descended into the kitchen. A mouse went scampering to its hole as he pushed open the door. The memory of that ravenous morning meal nauseated him. It was sour and very still here. He stood erect. The air smelt faint of earth. In the breakfast room the bookcase still swung open. Late evening mantled the garden, and in sheer ennui again he sat down to the table, and turned for a last, not unfriendly, hob a nob with his poor old friend Sabathier. He would take the thing back. Herbert, of course, was going to translate it for him. Now, if that patient old Frenchman had stormed Herbert instead, that surely would have been something like a coup. Those frenzied books, the absurd talk of the man. Herbert was perfectly right. He could have entertained 50 old Huguenots without turning a hair. I'm such an awful stodge. He turned the woolly leaves over very slowly. He frowned impatiently, and from the end backwards turned them over again. Then he laid the book softly down on the table and sat back. He stared with narrow lids into the flame of his quiet friendly candle. Every trace, every shred of portrait and memoir were gone. Once more deliberately, punctiliously he examined page by page the blurred and unfamiliar French, the sooty heads, the long lean noses, the baggy eyes passing like figures in a peep show one by one under his hand, to that last fragmentary and dexterously mended leaf. Yes, Sabathier was gone. Quite the old slow Lawford smile crept over his face at the discovery. It was a smile a little sheepish, too, as he thought of Sheila's quiet vigilance. And the next instant he had looked up sharply, with a sudden peculiar shrug and a kind of cry, like the first thin cry of an awakened child, in his mind. Without a moment's hesitation he climbed swiftly upstairs, again to the big sepulchral bedroom. He pressed with his fingernail the tiny spring in the looking-glass. The empty drawer flew open. There were finger marks still in the dust. Yet, strangely enough, beneath all the clashing thoughts that came flocking into his mind as he stood with the empty drawer in his hand, was a wounding, yet still a little amused pity for his old friend Mr. Bethany. So far as he himself was concerned, the discovery—well, he would have plenty of time to consider everything that could possibly now concern himself. Anyhow, it could only simplify matters. He remembered waking to that old wave of sickening horror on that first unhappy morning. He remembered the keen yet owlish old face blinking its deathless friendliness at him, and the steady pressure of the cold, skinny hand. As for Sheila, she had never done anything by halves. Certainly not when it came to throwing over a friend no longer necessary to one's social satisfaction. But she would edge out cleverly, magnanimously, triumphantly enough, no doubt, when the day of reckoning should come, the day when, her nets wide spread, her bait prepared, he must stand up before her outraged circle and positively prove himself her lawful husband, perhaps even to the very imprint of his thumb. "Poor old thing," he said again, and this time his pity was shared almost equally between both witnesses to Mr. Bethany's ingenuous little document, the loss of which had fallen so softly and pathetically that he felt only ashamed of having discovered it so soon. He shut back the tell-tale drawer, and after trying to collect his thoughts in case anything should have been forgotten, he turned with a deep trembling sigh to descend the stairs. But on the landing he drew back at the sound of voices, and then a footstep. Soon came the sound of a key in the lock. He blew out his candle, and leant, listening, over the balusters. "Who's there?" he called quietly. "Me, sir," came the feeble reply out of the darkness. "What is it, Ada? What have you come for?" "Only, sir, to see that all was safe, and you were in, sir." "Yes," he said, "all safe, and I am in. What if I had been out?" It was like dropping tiny pebbles into a deep well. So long after came the answering feeble splash. "Then I was to go back, sir." And a moment after, the discreet voice floated up with the faintest tinge of effrontery out of the hush. "Is that Dr. Ferguson too, sir?" "No, Ada, and please tell your mistress from me that Dr. Ferguson is unlikely to call again." A keen but rather forlorn smile passed over his face. "He's dining with friends, no doubt, at Holloway. But, of course, if she should want to see him, he will see her to morrow at any hour at Mrs. Lovett's. And, Ada—" "Yes, sir?" "Say that I'm a little better. Your mistress will be relieved to hear that I'm a little better. Still not quite myself, say, but, I think, a little better." "Yes, sir, and I'm sure I'm very glad to hear it," came fainter still. "What voice was that I heard just now?" "Miss Alice's, sir. But she came quite against my wishes, and I hope you won't repeat it, sir. She promised if she came that mistress shouldn't know. I was only afraid she might disturb you, or Dr. Ferguson. And did you say, sir, that I was to tell mistress that he might be coming back?" "Ah, that I don't know. So perhaps it would be as well not to mention him at all. Is Miss Alice there?" "I said I would tell her if you were alone, but I hope you'll understand that it was only because she begged so. Mistress has gone to St. Peter's Bazaar, and that's how it was.'
'I quite understand. Beckon to her.'
There came a hasty step in the hall, and a hurried murmur of explanation. Lawford heard her call as she ran up the stairs, and the next moment he had Alice's hand in his, and they were groping together through the gloaming back into the solitude of the empty room again.
'Don't be alarmed, dear,' he heard himself imploring. 'Just hold tight to that clear common sense. And above all, you won't tell? It must be our secret, a dead, dead secret from every one, even your mother, for just a little while, just a mere 2 days or so, in case I'm better, dear.' He fumbled with the little box of matches, dropped one, broke another, but at last the candle flame dipped, brightened, and with the door shut and the last pale blueness of dusk at the window, Lawford turned and looked at his daughter. She stood with eyes wide open, like the eyes of a child walking in its sleep, then twisted her fingers more tightly within his. 'Oh, dearest, how ill you look,' she whispered. 'But there, never mind, never mind. It was all a miserable dream then. It won't, it can't come back. I don't think I could bear its coming back. And mother told me such curious things, as if I were a child and understood nothing. And even after I knew that you were you, I mean before I sat up here in the dark to see you, she said that you were gone and would never come back. That a terrible thing had happened, a disgrace which we must never speak of. And that all the other was only a pretence to keep people from talking. But I did not believe then, and how could I believe afterwards? 'There, never mind now, dear, what she said. It was all meant for the best, perhaps, but here I am, and not nearly so ill as I look, Alice. And there's nothing more to trouble ourselves about, not even if it should be necessary for me to go away for a time. And this is our secret, mind, ours only, just a dead secret between you and me.'
They sat for a while without speaking or stirring, and faintly along the hushed road Lawford heard in the silence a leisurely, indolent beat of little hoofs approaching, and the sound of wheels. A sudden wave of feeling swept over him. He took Alice's quiet, loving face in his hands and kissed her passionately.
'Do not so much as think of me yet, or doubt, or question. Only love me, dearest. And soon, and soon.
We'll just begin again, won't we, all three of us together, just as we used to be? I didn't mean to have said all those horrid things about mother. She was only dreadfully anxious, and meant everything for the best. You'll let me tell her soon?' The haggard face turned slowly, listening.
'I hear, I understand, but I can't think very clearly now, Alice. I can't, dear. My miserable old tangled nerves. I just stumble along as best I can. You'll understand better when you get to be a poor old thing like me. We must do the best we can. And of course you'll see, Dilly, how awfully important it is not to raise false hopes. You understand? I mustn't risk the least thing in the world, must I? And now, good bye, only for a few hours now, and not a word to a single living soul.' He extinguished the candle again, and led the way to the top of the stairs. 'Are you there, Ada?'
'Yes, sir,' answered the quiet, imperturbable voice from under the black straw brim. Alice went slowly down, but at the foot of the stairs, looking out into the cold blue lamplit street, she paused, as if at a sudden recollection, and ran hastily up again. 'There was nothing more, dear?' she said, leaning back to peer up.
'Nothing more? What?
She stood panting a little in the darkness, listening to some cautious yet uneasy thought that seemed to haunt her mind. 'I thought it seemed there was something we had not said, something I could not understand. But there, it is nothing. You know what a fanciful old silly I am. You do love me? Quite as much as ever?'
'More, sweetheart, more.'
'Good night again, then. And God bless you, dear.' The outer door closed softly, the footsteps died away. Lawford still hesitated. He took hold of the stairs above his head as he stood on the landing and leaned his head upon his hands, striving calmly to disentangle the perplexity of his thoughts. His pulses were beating in his ear with a low muffled roar. He looked down between the blinds to where, against the blue of the road beneath the straggling yellow beams of the lamp, stood the little cart and drooping shaggy pony, and Grisel sitting quietly there awaiting him. He shut his eyes as if in hope by some convulsive effort of mind to break through this subtle glass-like atmosphere of dream that had stolen over consciousness and blotted out the significance, almost the meaning of the past. He turned abruptly. Empty as the empty rooms around him, unanswering were mind and heart. Life was a tale told by an idiot, signifying nothing. He paused at the head of the staircase, and even then the doubt confronted him. Would he ever come back? Who knows, he thought, and again stood pondering, arguing, denying. At last he seemed to have come to a decision. He made his way downstairs, opened and left ajar a long narrow window in a passage to the garden beyond the kitchen. He turned on his heel as he reached the gate, and waved his hand as if in a kind of forlorn mockery toward the darkly glittering windows. The drowsy pony awoke at touch of the whip. Grisel lifted the rug and squeezed a little closer into the corner. She had drawn a veil over her face, so that to Lawford her eyes seemed to be dreaming in a little darkness of their own as he laid his hand on the side of the cart. 'It's a most curious thing,' he said, 'but peeping down at you just now, when the sound of the wheels came, a memory came clearly back to me of years and years ago, of my mother. She used to come fetch me at school in a little cart like this, and a little pony just like this, with a thick dusty coat. And once I remember I was simply sick of everything, a failure and fagged out and all that, and was looking out in the twilight. I fancy even it was autumn too. It was a little side staircase window. I was horribly homesick, and she came quite unexpectedly. I shall never forget it. The misery, and then her coming.' He lifted his eyes, cowed with the incessant struggle, and watched her face for some time in silence. 'Ought I to stay?' 'I see no ought,' she said. 'No one is there?' 'Only a miserable broken voice out of a broken cage, called conscience.' 'Don't you think, perhaps, that even that has a good many disguises? Convention, cowardice, weakness, ennui, they all take their turn at hooting in its feathers. You must, you really must have rest. You don't know, you don't see. I do. Just a little snap, some one last exquisite thread gives way, and then it is all over. You see, I have even to try to frighten you, for I can't tell you how you distress me.' 'Why do I distress you? My face? My story, you mean?' 'No, I mean you. Your trouble, that horrible empty house, and, oh dear me, yes, your courage too.' 'Listen,' said Lawford, stooping forward. He could scarcely see the pale veiled face through this mist that had risen up over his eyes. 'I have no courage apart from you. No courage and no hope. Ask me to come. A stranger, with no history, no mockery, no miserable rant of a grave, and darkness and fear behind me. Are we not all haunted, every one? That forgotten, and the fool I was, and the vacillating, and the pretense, oh, how it all sweeps clear before me. Without a will, without a hope or glimpse or whisper of courage. Be just the memory of my mother, the face, the friend I've never seen. the voice that every dream leaves echoing. Ask me to come. She sat unstirring, and then, as if by some uncontrollable impulse, stooped a little closer to him and laid her gloved hand on his. 'I hear, you know. I hear too,' she whispered. 'But we mustn't listen. Come now, it's growing late.' The little village echoed back from its stone walls the clatter of the ponies' hoofs. Night had darkened to its deepest when their lamps shone white on the wicket in the hedge. They had scarcely spoken. Lawford had simply watched pass by, almost without a thought, the arching trees, the darkening fields; had watched rise up in a mist of primrose light the harvest moon to shine in saffron on the faces and shoulders of the few wayfarers they met, or who passed them by. The still grave face beneath the shadow of its veil had never turned, though the moon poured all her flood of brilliance upon the dark profile. And once, when as if in sudden alarm he had lifted his head and looked at her, a sudden doubt had assailed him so instantly that he had half put out his hand to touch her, and had as quickly withdrawn it, lest her beauty and stillness should be, even as the moment's fancy had suggested, only a far gone memory returned in dream. Herbert hailed them from the darkness of an open window. He came down, and they talked a little in the cold air of the garden. He lit a cigarette, and climbed languidly into the cart, and drove the drowsy little pony off into the moonlight. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Return by Walter de la Mare. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Corinna Schultz. It was a quiet supper the three friends sat down to. Herbert sat narrowing his eyes over his thoughts, which, when the fancy took him, he scattered out upon the other's silence. Lawford apparently had not yet shaken himself free from the sorcery of the moonlight. His eyes shone dark and full like those of a child who has trespassed beyond its hour for bed, and sits marvelling at reality in a waking dream. Long after they had bidden each other good night, long after Herbert had trodden on tiptoe with his candle past his closed door, Lawford sat leaning on his arms at the open window, staring out across the motionless moonlit trees that seemed to stand like draped and dreaming pilgrims, come to the peace of their nirvana at last beside the crashing music of the waters. And he himself, the self that never sleeps beneath the tides and waves of consciousness, was listening too, almost as unmovedly and unheedingly to the thoughts that clashed in conflict through his brain. Why, in a strange transitory life, was one the slave of these small cares? What if, even in that dark pit beneath, which seemed to whisper Lethe to the tumultuous swirling waters, what if there, too, were merely a beginning again, and to seek a slumbering refuge there merely a blind and reiterated plunge into the heat and tumult of another day? Who was that poor dark homeless ghoul Sabathier? Who was this Helen of an impossible dream? Her face with its strange smile, her eyes with their still pity and rapt courage, had taken hope away. 'Here's not your rest,' cried one insistent voice. 'She is the mystery that haunts day and night, past all the changing of the restless hours. Chance has given you back eyes to see, a heart that can be broken. Chance and the stirrings of a long gone life have torn down the veil age spins so thick and fast. Pride and ambition, what dull fools men are. Effort and duty, what dull fools men are.' He listened on and on to these phantom pleadings, and to the rather coarse old Lawford conscience grunting them mercilessly down, too weary even to try to rest. Rooks at dawn came sweeping beneath the turquoise of the sky. He saw their sharp-beaked heads turn this way, that way, as they floated on outspread wings across the misty world. Except for the hoarse roar of the water under the huge thin-leafed trees, not a sound was stirring.
One thing, he seemed to hear himself mutter as he turned with a shiver from the morning air. It won't be for long. You can, at least, poor devil, wait the last act out. If in this foolish hustling mob of the world, hired anywhere and anywhen for the one poor dubious wage of a penny, if it was only his own small dull part to carry a mock spear and shout huzzah with the rest, there was nothing for it, he grunted obstinately to himself. Shout he would with the loudest. He threw himself on to the bed with eyes so wearied with want of sleep it seemed they had lost their livelong skill in finding it. Not the echo of triumph nor even a sigh of relief stirred the torpor of his mind. He knew vaguely that what had been the misery and madness of the last few days was gone, but the thought had no power to move him now. Sheila's good sense and Mr. Bethany's stubborn loyalty were alike old stories that had lost their savour and meaning. Gone, too, was the need for that portentous family gathering that had sat so often in his fancy during these last few days, around his dining room table, discussing with futile decorum the problem of how to hush him up, to muffle him down. Half dreaming, half awake, he saw the familiar door slowly open, and, like the timely hero in a melodrama, his own figure appear before the stricken and astonished company. His eyes opened half fearfully and glanced up in the morning twilight. Their perplexity gave place to a quiet, almost vacant smile. The lids slowly closed again, and at last the lean hands twitched a while in sleep. Next morning he spent rummaging among the old books, dipping listlessly here and there as the tasteless fancy took him, while Herbert sat writing with serene face and lifted eyebrows at his open window. But the unfamiliar long S's, the close type, and the spelling of the musty old books wearied eye and mind. What he read, too, however far-fetched or lively or sententious or gross, seemed either to be of the same texture as what had become his everyday experience, and so baffled him with its nearness, or else was only the meaningless ramblings of an idle pen. And this, he thought to himself, looking covertly up at the spruce clear-cut profile at the window, this is what Herbert had called life. "Am I interrupting you, Herbert? Are you very busy?" he asked at last, taking refuge on a chair in a far corner of the room. "Bless me, no, not a bit," said Herbert amiably, laying down his pen. "I'm afraid the old leather jackets have been boring you. It's a habit, this beastly reading, this gorge and glint and fever all at second hand. Purely a bad habit, like morphia, like laudanum. But once in, you know there's no recovery. Anyhow, I'm neck deep, and to struggle would be simply to drown. I was only going to say how sorry I am for having left Sabathier at home." "My dear fellow," began Herbert reassuringly. "It was only because I wanted so very much to have your translation. I get muddled up with other things groping through the dictionary." Herbert surveyed him critically. "What exactly is your interest now, Lawford? You don't mean that my old theory has left any sting now?" "No sting, oh no. I was only curious. But you yourself still think it really, don't you?" Herbert turned for a moment to the open window. "I was simply trying then to find something to fit the facts as you experienced them. But now that the facts have gone—and they have, haven't they?—exit, of course, my theory." "I see," was the cryptic answer. "And yet, Herbert," Lawford solemnly began again, "it has changed me, even in my way of thinking. When I shut my eyes now, I only discovered it by chance, I see immediately faces quite strange to me, or places, sometimes thronged with people, and once an old well with some one sitting in the shadow, I can't tell you how clearly, and yet it is all altogether different from a dream. Even when I sit with my eyes open I am conscious, as it were, of a kind of faint, colourless mirage. In the old days, I mean before Widderstone, what I saw was only what I'd seen already. Nothing came uncalled for, unexplained. This makes the old life seem so blank. I did not know what extraordinarily real things I was doing without, and whether for that reason or another, I can't quite make out what in fact I did want then and was always fretting and striving for. I can see no wisdom or purpose in anything now but to get to one's journey's end as quickly and bravely as one can. And even then, even if we do call life a journey, and death the inn we shall reach at last in the evening when it's over, that too, I feel, will be only as brief a stopping place as any other inn would be. Our experience here is so scanty and shallow, nothing more than the moment of the continual present. Surely that must go on, even if one does call it eternity. And so we shall all have to begin again. Probably Sabathier himself. But there, what on earth are we, Herbert, when all is said? Who is it has done all this for us? What kind of self? And to what possible end? Is it that the clockwork has been wound up and must still jolt on a while with drawing wheels? Will it never run down, do you think? Herbert smiled faintly, but made no answer. "You see," continued Lawford, in the same quiet, dispassionate undertone, "I wouldn't mind if it was only myself. But there are so many of us, so many selves, I mean, and they all seem to have a voice in the matter. What is the reality to this infernal dream?" "The reality is, Lawford, that you are fretting your life out over this rotten illusion. Be guided by me just this once. We'll go, all three of us, a good 10-mile walk today, and thoroughly tire you out. And tonight you shall sleep here, a really sound, refreshing sleep. Then tomorrow, whole and hale, back you shall go. Honestly, it's only professional strong men should ask questions. Babes like you and me must keep to slops." So, though Lawford made no answer, it was agreed. Before noon the three of them had set out on their walk across the fields. And after rambling on just as caprice took them, past reddening blackberry bushes and copses of hazel and flaming beech, they sat down to spread out their meal on the slope of a hill overlooking quiet ploughed fields and grazing cattle. Herbert stretched himself with his back to the earth and his placid face to the pale vacant sky, while Lawford, even more dispirited after his walk, wandered up to the crest of the hill. At the foot of the hill, upon the other side, lay a farm and its outbuildings and a pool of water beneath a group of elms. It was vacant in the sunlight and the water vividly green with the scum of weed. And about half a mile beyond stood a cluster of cottages and an old towered church. He gazed idly down, listening vaguely to the wailing of a curlew flitting anxiously to and fro above the broken solitude of its green hill. And it seemed as if a thin and dark cloud began to be quietly withdrawn from over his eyes. Hill and wailing cry and barn and water faded out. And he was staring as if in an endless stillness at an open window against which the sun was beating in a bristling torrent of gold, while out of the garden beyond came a voice of some evening bird singing with such an unspeakable ecstasy of grief, it seemed it must be perched upon the confines of another world. The light gathered to a radiance almost intolerable, driving back with its raining beams some memory, forlorn, remorseless, remote. His body stood dark and senseless, rocking in the air on the hillside as if bereft of its spirit. Then his hands were drawn over his eyes, he turned unsteadily and made his way, as if through a thick drizzling haze, slowly back. "What is that there?" he said almost menacingly, standing with bloodshot eyes looking down upon Herbert. "That? What?" said Herbert, glancing up, startled from his book. "Why, what's wrong, Lawford?" "That," said Lawford sullenly, yet with a faintly mournful cadence in his voice, "those fields, and that old empty farm, that village over there. Why did you bring me here?" Grisel had not stirred. "The village—" "Sh!" she said, catching her brother's sleeve. "That's Detcham. Yes, Detcham."
Lawford turned wide vacant eyes on her. He shook his head and shuddered. "No, no, not Detcham. I know it. I know it, but it has gone out of my mind. Not Detcham. I've been there before. Don't look at me. Horrible, horrible. It takes me back. I can't think. I stood there trying. It's all in a blur. Don't ask me. A dream." Grisel leaned forward and touched his hand. "Don't think. Don't even try. Why should you? We can't, we mustn't go back." Lawford, still gazing fixedly, turned again a darkened face towards the steep of the hill. "I think, you know," he said, stooping and whispering. He would know. The window and the sun and the singing. And oh, of course it was too late. You understand, too late. And once... You can't go back. Oh no. You won't leave me? You see, if you go, it would only be all. I could not be quite so alone. But Detcham, perhaps you will not trust me. Tell me, that was not the name.' He shuddered violently and turned dog-like, beseeching eyes. 'Tomorrow, yes, tomorrow,' he said, 'I will promise anything if you will not leave me now. Once—' But again the thread running so faintly through that inextricable maze of memory eluded him. 'So long as you won't leave me now,' he implored her. She was vainly trying to win back her composure, and could not answer him at once. In the evening after supper Grisel sat her guest down in front of a big wood fire in the old book room, where, staring into the playing flames, he could fall at peace into the almost motionless reverie which he seemed merely to harass and weary himself by trying to disperse. She opened the little piano at the far end of the room and played on and on as fancy led. Chopin and Beethoven, a fugue from Bach, and lovely forlorn old English airs, till the music seemed not only a voice persuading, pondering, and lamenting, but gathering about itself the hollow surge of the water and the darkness, wistful and clear as the thoughts of a solitary child. Ever and again a log burnt through its strength, and falling amid sparks, stirred like a restless animal the stillness. Or Herbert in his corner lifted his head to glance towards his visitor and to turn another page. At last the music, too, fell silent, and Lawford stood up with his candle in his hand and eyed with a strange fixity brother and sister. His glance wandered slowly round the quiet, flame-lit room. 'You won't,' he said, stooping towards them as if in extreme confidence, 'you won't much notice. They come and go. I try not to speak. It's the only way through. It is not that I don't know they're only dreams. But if once the others thought there had been any tampering—' He tapped his forehead meaningly. 'Here, if once they thought that, it would, you know, be quite over, then how could I prove—' He turned cautiously towards the door, and with laborious significance nodded his head at them. Herbert bent down and held out his long hands to the fire. 'Tampering, my dear chap, that's what the lump said to the leaven.' 'Yes, yes,' said Lawford, putting out his hand, 'but you know what I mean, Herbert. Anything I tried to do then would be quite, quite hopeless. That would be poisoning the wells.' They watched him out of the room, and listened till quite distinctly in the still night shaded house they heard his door gently close. Then, as if by consent, they turned and looked long and questioningly into each other's faces. 'Then you are not afraid?' Herbert said quietly. Grisel gazed steadily on, and almost imperceptibly shook her head. 'You mean?' he questioned her, but still he had again to read her answer in her eyes. 'Oh, very well, Grisel,' he said quietly, 'you know best,' and returned once more to his writing. For an hour or two Lawford slept heavily. So heavily that when a little after midnight he awoke, with his face towards the uncurtained window, though for many minutes he lay brightly confronting all Orion, that, from blazing helm to flaming dog at heel, filled high the glimmering square, he could not lift or stir his cold and leaden limbs. He rose at last and threw off the burden of his bedclothes, and rested a while, as if freed from the heaviness of an unrememberable nightmare. But so clear was his mind, and so extraordinarily refreshed he seemed in body, that sleep for many hours would not return again, and he spent almost all the remainder of the lagging darkness pacing softly to and fro, one face only before his eyes, the one sure thing, the one thing unattainable in a world of phantoms. Herbert waited on in vain for his guest next morning, and after wandering up and down the mossy lawn at the back of the house, went off cheerfully at last, alone, for his dip. When he returned, Lawford was in his place at the breakfast table. He sat on, moody and constrained, until even Herbert's haphazard talk trickled low. "I fancy my sister is nursing a headache," he said at last, "but she'll be down soon. And I'm afraid from the looks of you, Lawford, your night was not particularly restful." He felt his way very heedfully. "Perhaps we walked you a little too far yesterday. We are so used to tramping that—" Lawford kept thoughtful eyes fixed on the deprecating face. "I see what it is, Herbert. You are humouring me again. I have been racking my brains in vain to remember what exactly did happen yesterday. I feel as if it was all sunk oceans deep in sleep. I get so far, and then I'm done. It won't give up a hint. But you really mustn't think I'm an invalid, or in my second childhood. The truth is," he added, "it's only my first come back again. But now that I've got so far, now that I'm really better, I—" He broke off rather vacantly, as if afraid of his own confidence. "I must be getting on," he summed up with an effort, "and that's the solemn fact. I keep on forgetting I'm a ratepayer." Herbert sat round in his chair. "You see, Lawford, the very term is little else than double Dutch to me. As a matter of fact, Grizzle sends all my hush money to the horrible people that do the cleaning up, as it were. I can't catch their drift. Government to me is merely the spectacle of the clever or the specious managing the dull. It deals merely with the physical and just the fringe of consciousness. I am not joking. I think I follow you. All I mean is that the obligations, mainly tepid I take it, that are luring you back to the fold, would be the very ones that would scare me quickest off. The imagination, the appeal faded. We're dead." Lawford opened his mouth. "Temporarily tepid," he at last all but coughed out. "Oh yes, of course," said Herbert intelligently, "only temporarily. It's this beastly gregariousness that's the devil. The very thought of it undoes me, with an absolute shock of sheepishness. I suddenly realize my human nakedness, that here we are, little better than naked animals, bleating behind our illusory wattles on the slopes of infinity. And nakedness, after all, is a wholesome thing to realize only when one thinks too much of one's clothes. I peer sometimes, feebly enough, out of my wool, and it seems to me that all these busybodies, all these fact devourers, all this news-reading rabble, are nothing brighter than very dull-witted children trying to play an imaginative game, much too deep for their poor reasons. I don't mean that your wanting to go home is anything gregarious, but I do think their insisting on your coming back at once might be. And I know you won't visit this stuff on me as anything more than just my scum, as Grizzle calls the fine flower of my maiden meditations. All that I really want to say is that we should both be more than delighted if you'd stay just as long as it will not be a bore for you to stay. Stay till you're heartily tired of us. Go back now if you must. Tell them how much better you are. Bolt off to a nerve specialist. He'll say complete rest, change of scene, and all that. They all do. Instinct via intellect. And why not take your rest here? We are such miserably dull company to one another. It would be a greater pleasure to have you with us than I can say. I mean it, from the very bottom of my heart. Do.' Lawford listened. 'I wish—' he began, and stopped dead again. 'Anyhow, I'll go back. I am afraid, Herbert, I've been playing truant. It was all very well while... To tell you the truth, I can't think quite straight yet. But it won't last forever. Besides, well, anyhow, I'll go back.' 'Right you are,' said Herbert, pretending to be cheerful. 'You can't expect, you really can't, everything to come right straight away. Just have patience. And now let's go out and sit in the sun. They've mixed September up with May.' And about half an hour afterwards he glanced up from his book to find his visitor fast asleep in his garden chair. Grisel had taken her brother's place, with a little pile of needlework beside her on the grass, when Lawford again opened his eyes under the rosy shade of a parasol. He watched her for a while without speaking. 'How long have I been asleep?' he said at last. She started and looked up from her needle. 'That depends on how long you have been awake,' she said, smiling. 'My brother tells me,' she went on, beginning to stitch, 'that you have made up your mind to leave us to day. Perhaps we are only flattering ourselves it has been a rest. But if it has, is that, do you think, quite wise?' He leaned forward and hid his face in his hands. It's because it's the only must I can see.' 'But even musts—well, we have to be sure even of musts, haven't we? Are you?' She glanced up, and for an instant their eyes met, and the falling water seemed to be sounding out of a distance so remote it might be but the echo of a dream. She stooped once more over her work. 'Supposing,' he said very slowly, and almost as if speaking to himself, 'supposing Sabathier—and you know he's merely like a friend now one mustn't be seen talking to—supposing he came back, what then?' 'Oh, but Sabathier's gone. He never really came. It was only a fancy, a mood. It was only you. Another you.' 'Who was that yesterday, then?' She glanced at him swiftly, and knew the question was but a venture. 'Yesterday?' 'Oh, very well,' he said fretfully, 'you too. But if he did come, really back, prey and all—' 'What is the riddle?' she said, taking a deep breath and facing him brightly. 'Would my must still be his?' The face he raised to her, as he leaned forward under the direct light of the sun, was so colourless, cadaverous, and haggard, the thought crossed her mind that it did indeed seem little more than a shadowy mask that but 1 hour of darkness might dispel. 'You said, you know, we did win through. Why, then, should we even be thinking of defeat now?' 'We?' 'Oh no, you!' she cried triumphantly. 'You do not answer my question.' 'Nor you mine. It was a glorious victory. Is there the ghost of a reason why you should cast your mind back? Is there now?' 'Only,' said Lawford, looking patiently up into her face, 'only because I love you.' And listened in the silence to the words as one may watch a bird that has escaped for ever and irrevocably out of its cage, steadily flying on till lost to sight. For an instant the grey eyes faltered. 'But that surely,' she began in a low voice, still steadily sewing, 'that was our compact last night, that you should let me help, that you should trust me, just as you trusted the mother years ago, who came in the little cart with the shaggy dusty pony to the homesick boy watching at the window. Perhaps,' she added, her fingers trembling, 'in this odd shuffle of souls and faces, I am that mother, and most frightfully anxious you should not give in. Why, even because of the tiredness, even because the cause seems vain, you must still fight on. Wouldn't she have said it? Surely there are prizes, a daughter, a career, no end. And even they gone, still the self, undimmed, undaunted, that took its drubbing like a man. I know you know I'm all but crazed. You see this wretched mind all littered and broken down. Look at me like that then. Forget even you have befriended me and pretended. Why must I blunder on and on like this? Oh, Grisel, my friend, if only you loved me. Tears clouded her eyes. She turned vaguely as if for a hiding place. We can't talk here. How mad the day is! Listen, listen. I do. I do love you, mother and woman and friend, from the very moment you came. It's all so clear, that and your miserable must, my friend. Come, we will go away by ourselves a little and talk. That way. I'll meet you by the gate. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Return by Walter de la Mare. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Corinna Schultz. She came out into the sunlight, and they went through the little gate together. She walked quickly, without speaking, over the bridge, past a little cottage whose hollyhocks leaned fading above its low flint wall. Skirting a field of stubble, she struck into a wood by a path that ran steeply up the hillside, and by they came to a glen where the woodmen of a score of years ago had felled the trees, leaving a green hollow of saplings in the midst of their towering neighbours. "There," she said, holding out her hand to him. "Now we are alone. Just 6 hours or so, and then the sun will be there." She pointed to the tree-tops to the west. "And then you will have to go. For good. For good. You your way, and I mine. What a tangle is this life of ours. Could I have dreamt we should ever be talking like this, you and I? Friends of an hour, what will you think of me? Does it matter? Don't speak. Say nothing. Poor face, poor hands. If only there were something to look to pray to." She bent over his hand and pressed it to her breast. "What worlds we've seen together, you and I. And then another parting." They wandered on a little way and came back and listened to the first few birds that flew up into the higher branches, noonday being past, to sing. They talked and were silent, and talked again without question or sadness or regret or reproach. She mocking even at themselves, mocking at this change. Why, and yet without it, would you ever even have dreamed once a poor fool of a Frenchman went to his restless grave for me? For me? Need we understand? Were we told to pry? Who made us human must be human too. Why must we take such care and make such fret, this soul? I know it. It is all we have to save, they say, poor creatures. No, never to spend. And so they daren't for a solitary instant lift it on the finger from its cage. Well, we have, and now soon back it must go. Back it must go and try its best to whistle the day out. And yet, do you know, perhaps the very freedom does a little shake its monotony. It's true, you see. They have lived a long time, these worldly wise folk. They were wise before they were swaddled. There. And you are hungry? She asked him, laughing in his eyes. Of course you are. Scarcely a mouthful since that first still wonderful supper. And you haven't slept a wink, except like a tired-out child after its first party, on that old garden chair. I sat and watched, and yes, almost hoped you'd never wake in case. Come along, see, down there. I can't go home just yet. There's a little old inn. We'll go and sit down there, as if we were really trying to be romantic. I know the woman quite well. We can talk there, just the day out. They sat at a little table in the garden of the cherry trees, its thick green apple branches burdened with ripened fruit, and Grizel tried to persuade him to eat and drink. "For tomorrow we die," she said, her hands trembling, her face as it were veiled with a faint mysterious light. "There are dozens and dozens of old stories, you know," she said, leaning on her elbows. "Dozens and dozens, meaning only us. You must eat. Look, just an apple. We've got to say goodbye, and faintness will double the difficulty." She lightly touched his hand as if to compel him to smile with her. "There, I'll peel it, and this is Eden, and soon it will be the cool of the evening, and then, oh yes, the voice will come." "What nonsense I am talking. Never mind." They sat on in the quiet sunshine, and a spider slid softly through the air and with busy claws set to its nets, and those small ghosts, the robins, went whistling restlessly among the heavy boughs. A child presently came out of the porch of the inn into the garden, and stood with its battered doll in its arms, softly watching them a while. But when Grizel smiled and tried to coax her over, she burst out laughing and ran in again. Lawford stooped forward on his chair with a groan. "You see," he said, "the whole world mocks me. You say this evening. Need it be, must it be this evening? If you only knew how far they have driven me. If you only knew what we should only detest each other for saying and for listening to. The whole thing's dulled and staled. Who wants a changeling? Who wants a painted bird? Who does not loathe the converted? And I'm converted to Sabathier's God. Should we be sitting here talking like this if it were not so? I can't go back." She rose and stood with her hand pressed over her mouth, watching him. "Won't you understand?" he continued. "I am an outcast, a felon, caught red-handed, come in the flesh to a hideous and righteous judgment. I hear myself saying all these things, and yet, Grizel, I do love you with all the dull best I ever had. Not now, then. I don't ask new, even. I would begin again. God knows my face has changed enough, even as it is. Think of me as that poor wandering ghost of yours. How easily I could hide away in your memory and just wait for you. In time, even this wild, futile madness too would fade away. Then I could come back. May I try? I can't answer you. I can't reason. Only still I do know, talk, put off, forget as I may, must is must. Right and wrong, who knows what they mean, except that one's to be done and one's to be forsworn. Or, forgive, my friend, the truest thing I ever said, or else we lose the savour of both. Oh, then, and I know too you'd weary of me. I know you, Monsieur Nicholas, better than you can ever know yourself, though you have risen from your grave. You follow a dream, no voice or face or flesh and blood, and not to do what the one old raven within you cries you must, would be in time to hate the very sound of my footsteps. You shall go back, poor turncoat, and face the clearness, the utterly more difficult, bald and heartless clearness, as together we faced the dark. Life is a little while, and though I have no words to tell what always are and must be foolish reasons, because they are not reasons at all but ghosts of memory, I know in my heart that to face the worst is your only hope of peace. Should I have staked so much on your finding that and not throw up the game? Don't let us talk any more. I'll walk half the way, perhaps. Perhaps I will walk all the way. I think my brother guesses, at least, my madness. I've talked and talked him nearly past his patience. And then, when you are quite safely, oh yes, quite safely and soundly gone, Then I shall go away for a little, so that we can't even hear each other speak, except in dreams. Life, well, I always thought it was much too plain a tale to have as dull an ending. And with us, the powers beyond have played a newer trick, that's all. Another hour, and we will go. Till then, there's just the solitary walk home, and only the dull old haunted house that hoards as many ghosts as we ourselves to watch our coming. Evening began to shine between the trees. They seemed to stand aflame with a melancholy rapture in their uplifted boughs above their fading coats. The fields of the garnered harvest shone with a golden stillness, a-whir with shimmering flocks of starlings. And the old birds that had sung in the spring sang now amid the same leaves, grown older too, to give them harbourage. Herbert was sitting in his room when they returned, nursing his teacup on his knee while he pretended to be reading, with elbow propped on the table. "Here's Nicholas Sabathier, my dear, come to say good-bye a while," said Grisel. She stood for a moment in her white gown, her face turned towards the clear green twilight of the open window. "I have promised to walk part of the way with him, but I think first we must have some tea. No, he flatly refuses to be driven. We are going to walk." The two friends were left alone, face to face with a rather difficult silence. Only the least degree of nervousness apparent, so far as Herbert was concerned, in that odd aloof sustained air of impersonality that had so baffled his companion in their first queer talk together. "Your sister said just now, Herbert," blurted Lawford at last, "here's Nicholas Sabathier come to say good-bye. Well, what I want you to understand is that it is Sabathier, the worst he ever was, but also that it is good-bye." Herbert slowly turned. "I don't quite see why good-bye, Lawford, and frankly there is nothing to explain. We have chosen to live such a very out-of-the-way life," he went on, as if following up a train of thought. "The truth is, if one wants to live at all, one's own life, I mean, there's no time for many friends. And just steadfastly regarding your neighbour's tale as you follow it down into the nowhere, it's that seems to me the deadliest form of hypnotism. One must simply go one's own way, doing one's best to free one's mind of cant. And I dare say clearing some excellent stuff out with the rubbish. One consequence is that I don't think, however foolhardy it may be to say so, I don't think I care a groat for any opinion as human as my own, good or bad. My sister's a million times a better woman than I am a man. What possibly could there be, then, for me to say?" He turned with a nervous smile. "Why should it be good-bye?" Lawford glanced involuntarily towards the door that stood in shadow, duskily ajar. "Well," he said, "we have talked, and we think it must be that, until, at least," he smiled faintly, "I can come as quietly as your old ghost you told me of, and in that case it may not be so very long to wait." Their eyes met fleetingly across the still listening room. "The more I think of it," Lawford pushed slowly on, "the less I understand the frantic purposelessness of all that has happened to me. Until I went down, as you said, a godsend of a little Miss Muffet, and the inconceivable farce came off, I was fairly happy, fairly contented to dance my little wooden dance and wait till the showman should put me down into his box again. And now, well, here I am. The whole thing has gone by, and scarcely left a trace of its visit. Here I am for all my friends to swear to. And yet, Herbert, if you'll forgive me for troubling you with this stuff about myself, not a single belief or thought or desire remains unchanged. You will remember all that, I hope. It's not, of course, the ghost of an apology, only the mere facts." Herbert rose and paced slowly across to the window. "The longer I live, Lawford, the more I curse this futile gift of speech. Here am I, wanting to tell you, to say out frankly what, if mind could appeal direct to mind, would be merely as the wind passing through the leaves of a tree, with just one
one multitudinous rustle, but which, if I tried to put into words, well, daybreak would find us still groping on. He turned, a peculiar wry smile on his face. It's a dumb world, but there we are, and some day you'll come again. Well, said Lawford, as if with an almost hopeless effort to turn thought into such primitive speech, that's where we stand then. He got up suddenly like a man awakened in the midst of unforeseen danger. "Where's your sister?" he cried, looking into the shadow. And as if in actual answer to his entreaty, they heard the clinking of the cups on the little old green lacquer tray she was at that moment carrying into the room. She sat down on the window seat and put the tray down beside her. "It will be before dark even now," she said, glancing out at the faintly burning skies. They had trudged on together with almost as deep a sense of physical exhaustion as peasants have who have been labouring in the fields since daybreak. And a little beyond the village, before the last long road began that led in presently to the housed and scrupulous suburb, she stopped with a sob beside an old scarred milestone by the wayside. "This is as far as I can go," she said. She stooped and laid her hand on the cold moss-grown surface of the stone. "Even now it's wet with dew." She rose again and looked strangely into his face. "Yes, yes, here it is," she said. "Oh, and worse, worse than any fear. But nothing now can trouble you again of that. We're both at least past that." "Grisel," he said, "forgive me, but I can't go on." Don't think," she said, taking his hands and lifting them to her bosom. "It's only how the day goes, and it has all, my one dear, happened scores and scores of times before, mother and child and friend, and lovers that are all these too like us. We mustn't cry out. Perhaps it was all before even we could speak. This sorrow came. Take all the hope and all the future, and then may come our chance." "What's life to me now? You said the desire would come back, that I should shake myself free. I could if you would help me. I don't know what you are or what your meaning is, only that I love you, care for nothing, wish for nothing but to see you and think of you. A flat, dull voice keeps saying that I have no right to be telling you all this. You will know best. I know I am nothing. I ask nothing. If we love one another, what is there else to say?" Nothing to say except only goodbye. What could you tell me that I have not told myself over and over again? Reason's gone. Thinking's gone. Now I am only sure." She smiled shaddily. "What peace did he find who couldn't, perhaps, like you, face the last goodbye?" They stood in utter solitude a while in the evening gloom. The air was as still and cold as some grey unfathomable, untraversed sea. Above them uncountable clouds drifted slowly across space. "Why do they all keep whispering together?" he said in a low voice, with cowering face. "Oh, if you knew, Grisel, how they have hemmed me in, how they have come pressing in through the narrow gate I left ajar, only to mock and mislead. It's all dark and unintelligible." He touched her hand, peering out of the shadows that seemed to him to be gathering between their faces. He drew her closer and touched her lips with his fingers. Her beauty seemed to his distorted senses to fill earth and sky. This, then, was the presence, the grave and lovely overshadowing dream whose surrender made life a torment and death the near fold of an immortal starry veil. She broke from him with a faint cry, and he found himself running and running, just as he had run that other night, with death instead of life for inspiration, towards his earthly home. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Return by Walter de la Mare. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
Corinna Schultz. He was utterly wearied, but he walked on for a long while with a dogged, unglancing pertinacity and without looking behind him. Then he rested under the dew-sodden hedge-side and buried his face in his hands. Once, indeed, he did turn and grind his way back with hard uplifted face for many minutes, but at the meeting with an old woman who, in the late dusk, passed him unheeded on the road, he stopped again, and after standing a while looked down upon the dust, trying to gather up the tangled threads of his thoughts. He once more set off homewards. It was clear, starry, and quite dark when he reached the house. The lamp at the roadside obscurely lit its breadth and height. Lamplight within, too, was showing yellow between the Venetian blinds. A cold gas jet gleamed out of the basement window. He seemed bereft now of all desire or emotion, simply the passive witness of things external in a calm, which, though he scarcely realized its cause, was an exquisite solace and relief. His senses were intensely sharpened with sleeplessness. The faintest sound belled clear and keen on his ear. The thinnest beam of light besprinkled his eyes with curious brilliance. As quietly as some nocturnal creature he ascended the steps to the porch, and leaning between stone pilaster and wall, listened intently for any rumour of those within. He heard a clear, rather languid and delicate voice quietly speak on until it broke into a little peal of laughter, followed, when it fell silent, by Sheila's, rapid, rich, and low. The first speaker seemed to be standing. Probably, then, his evening visitors had only just come in or were preparing to depart. He inserted his latchkey and gently pushed at the cumbersome door. It was locked against him. With not the faintest thought of resentment or surprise, he turned back, stooped over the balustrade, and looked down into the kitchen. Nothing there was visible but a narrow strip of the white table, on which lay a black cotton glove, and beyond the glint of a copper pan. What made all these mute and inanimate things so coldly hostile? An extreme, almost nauseous distaste filled him at the thought of knocking for admission, of confronting Ada, possibly even Sheila, in the cold echoing gloom of the detestable porch, of meeting the first wild, almost metallic flash of recognition. He swept softly down again and paused at the open gate. Once before the voices of the night had called him. They would not summon him forever in vain. He raised his eyes again towards the window. Who were these visitors met together to drum the alien out? He narrowed his lids and smiled up at the vacuous, unfriendly house. Then, wheeling on a sudden impulse, he groped his way down the gravel path that led into the garden. As he had left it, the long white window was ajar. With extreme caution he pushed it noiselessly up and climbed in, and stood listening again in the black passage on the other side. When he had fully recovered his breath, and the knocking of his heart was stilled, he trod on softly, till, turning the corner, he came in sight of the kitchen door. It was now narrowly open, just enough, perhaps, to admit a cat. And as he softly approached, looking steadily in, he could see Ada sitting at the empty table, beneath the single whistling chandelier, in her black dress and black straw hat. She was reading apparently, but her back was turned to him, and he could not distinguish her arm beyond the elbow. Then almost in an instant he discovered, as, drawn up and unstirring, he gazed on, that she was not reading, but had covertly and instantaneously raised her eyes from the print on the table beneath, and was transfixedly listening, too. He turned his eyes away and waited. When again he peered in, she had apparently bent once more over her magazine, and he stole on. One by one, with a thin remote exultation in his progress, he mounted the kitchen stairs, and with each deliberate and groping step the voices above him became more clearly audible. At last, in the darkness of the hall, but faintly stirred by the gleam of lamplight from the chink of the dining-room door, he stood on the threshold of the drawing-room door and could hear with varying distinctness what those friendly voices were so absorbedly discussing. His ear seemed as exquisite as some contrivance of science, registering passively the least sound, the faintest syllable, and like it, in no sense meddling with the thought that speech conveyed. He simply stood listening, fixed and motionless, like some uncouth statue in the leafy hollow of a garden, stony, unspeculating. "Oh, but you either refuse to believe, Betty, or you won't understand that it's far worse than that." Sheila seemed to be upbraiding, or at least reasoning with, the last speaker. "Ask Mr. Danton. He actually saw him."
"Saw him," repeated a thick, still voice. "He stood there, in that very doorway, Mrs. Lovett, and positively railed at me. He stood there and streamed out all the names he could lay his tongue to. I wasn't unfriendly to the poor beggar. When Bethany let me into it, I thought it was simply, I did indeed, Mrs. Lawford, a monstrous exaggeration. Flatly, I didn't believe it. Shall I say that? But when I stood face to face with him, I could have taken my oath that it was no more poor old Arthur Lawford than, well, I won't repeat what particular word occurred to me. But there." The corpulent shrug was almost audible. "We all know what old Bethany is. A sterling old chap, mind you, so far as mere character is concerned. The right man in the right place. But as gullible and as soft-hearted as a tomtit. I've said all this before, I know, Mrs. Lawford, and been properly snubbed for my pains. But if I had been Bethany, I'd have sifted the whole story at the beginning, the moment he put his foot into the house. Look at that Tichborne fellow, went for months and months, just picking up one day what he floored old Hawkins, wasn't it, with the next. But, of course," he added gloomily, "now that's all too late. He's moaned himself into a tolerably tight corner. I'd like to see, though, a British jury comparing this claimant with his photograph. 'Pon my word, I would. Where would he be then, do you think?" "But, my dear Mr. Danton," went on the clear, languid voice Lawford had heard break so light-heartedly into laughter, "you don't mean to tell me that a woman doesn't know her own husband when she sees him? Or, for the matter of that, when she doesn't see him? If Tom came home from a ramble as handsome as Apollo to-morrow, I'd recognize him at the very first blush, literally. He'd go nuzzling off to get his slippers, or complain that the lamps had been smoking, or hunt the house down for last week's paper. Oh, besides, Tom's Tom, and there's an end of it." "That's precisely what I think, Mrs. Lovett. One is saturated with one's personality, as it were."
"You see, that's just it. That's just exactly every woman's husband all over. He is saturated with his personality. Bravo, Mr. Craik."
"Good Lord," said Danton softly. "I don't deny it."
"But that," broke in Sheila crisply, "that's just precisely what I asked you all to come in for. It's because I know now, apart altogether from the mere evidence, that he is Arthur. Mind, I don't say I ever really doubted. I was only so utterly shocked, I suppose. I positively put posers to him. But his memory was perfect, in spite of the shock which would have killed a more sensitive nature." She had risen, it seemed, and was moving with all her splendid impressiveness of silk and presence across the general line of vision. But the hall was dark and still. Her eyes were dimmed with light. Lawford could survey her there unmoved. "Are you there, Ada?" she called discreetly. "Yes, ma'am," answered the faint voice from below. "You have not heard anything? No knock?" "No, ma'am, no knock." "The door is open if you should call." "Yes, ma'am." "The girl's scared out of her wits," said Sheila, returning to her audience. "I've told you all that miserable Ferguson story. A piece of calm, callous presence of mind I should never have dreamed my husband capable of. And the curious thing is, at least, it is no longer curious in the light of the ghastly facts I am only waiting for Mr. Bethany to tell you. From the very first she instinctively detested the very mention of his name. I believe, you know," said Mr. Craik with some decision, "that servants must have the same wonderful instinct as dogs and children. They are natural, intuitive judges of character." "Yes," said Sheila gravely, "and it's only through that. that I got to hear of the mysterious friend in the little pony carriage. Ada's magnificently loyal, I will say that.' 'I don't want to suggest anything, Mrs Lawford,' began Mr Craik rather hurriedly, 'but wouldn't it perhaps be wiser not to wait for Mr Bethany? It is not at all unusual for him to be kept a considerable time in the vestry after service, and today is the feast of St Michael's and All Angels, you know. Mightn't your husband be coming back, don't you think?' 'Craik's right, Mrs Lawford. It's not a bit of good waiting. Bethany would stick there till midnight if any old woman's spiritual state could keep her going so long. Here we all are, and at any moment we may be interrupted. Mind you, I promise nothing, only that there shall be no scene. But here I am, and if he does come knocking and ringing and lunging out in the disgusting manner well, all I ask is permission to speak for you. 'Pon my soul, to think what you must have gone through! It isn't the place for ladies just now. Honestly, it ain't.'
'Besides, supposing the romantic lady of the pony carriage has friends, are you a pugilist, Mr Craik? I hope I could give some little account of myself, Mrs Lovat, but you need have no anxiety about that.' 'There, Mr Danton. So, as there is not the least cause for anxiety, even if poor Arthur should return to his earthly home, may we share your dreadful story at once, Sheila? And then, perhaps, hear Mr Bethany's exposition of it when he does arrive? We are amply guarded.'
'Honestly, you know, you are a bit of a sceptic, Mrs Lovat,' pleaded Danton playfully. 'I've seen him.'
'And seeing is disbelieving, I suppose. Now then, Sheila.' 'I don't think there's the least chance of Arthur returning to-night,' said Sheila solemnly. 'I am perfectly well aware it's best to be as cheerful as one can, and as resolved. But I think, Betty, when even you know the whole horrible secret, you won't think Mr Danton was horrified for nothing. The ghastly, the awful truth is that my husband—there is no other word for it—is possessed.'
'Possessed, Sheila? What in the name of all the creeps is that?'
'Well, I dare say Mr Craik will explain it much better than I can.'
'By a devil, dear.'
The voice was perfectly poised and restrained, and Mr Craik did not see fit for the moment to embellish the definition. Lawford, with an almost wooden immobility, listened on. 'But the devil or a devil? Isn't there a distinction?' inquired Mrs Lovat. 'It's in the Bible, Betty, over and over again. It was quite a common thing in the Middle Ages. I think I'm right in saying that, am I not, Mr Craik?' Mr Craik must have solemnly nodded or abundantly looked his unwilling affirmation. 'And what has been,' continued Sheila temperately, 'I suppose may be again.'
'When the fellow began raving at me the other night,' began Danton huskily, as if out of an unfathomable pit of reflection, 'among other things he said that I haven't any wish to remember was that I was a sceptic. And Bethany said ditto to it. I don't mind being called a sceptic. Why, I said myself Mrs Lovat was a sceptic just now. But when it comes to devils, Mrs Lawford, I may be convinced about the other, but devils... Well, I've been in the city nearly 25 years, and it's my impression human nature can raise all the devils we shall ever need. And another thing,' he added as if inspired, and with an immensely intelligent blink, 'is it just precisely that word in the Revised Version? Craik?'
'I'll certainly look it up, Danton, but I take it that Mrs Lawford is not so much insisting on the word as on the manifestation. And I'm bound to confess that the Society for Psychical Research, which has among its members quite eminent and entirely trustworthy men of science, I am bound to admit they have some very curious stories to tell. The old idea was, you know, that there are 72 princely devils and as many as 7,000,000 commoners. It may very well sound quaint to our ears, Mrs Lovat, but there it is. But whether that has any bearing on what you were saying, Danton, I can't say. Perhaps Mrs Lawford will throw a little more light on the subject when she tells us on what precise facts her distressing theory is based.' Lawford had soundlessly stolen a pace or two nearer,
and by stooping forward a little he could, each in turn, scrutinize the little intent company sitting over his story around the lamp at the further end of the table, squatting like little children with their twigs and pins, fishing for wonders on the brink of the unknown. "Yes," Mrs. Lovett was saying, "I quite agree, Mr. Craik. 72 princes and no princesses. Oh, these masculine prejudices. But do throw a little more modern light on the subject, Sheila." "I mean this," said Sheila firmly. "When I went in for the last time to say good-bye, and of course it was at his own wish that I did leave him, and precisely why he wished it is now unhappily only too apparent. I had brought him some money from the bank, £50 I think, yes, £50, and quite by the merest chance I glanced down, in passing, at a book he had apparently been reading, a book which he seemed very anxious to conceal with his hand. Arthur is not a great reader, though I believe he studied a little before we were married, and, well, I detest anything like subterfuge, and I said it out without thinking. 'Why, you're reading French, Arthur.' He turned deathly white, but made no answer. 'And can't you even confide to us the title, Sheila?' sighed Mrs. Lovett reproachfully. 'Wait a minute,' said Sheila. 'You shall make as much fun of the thing as you like, Betty, when I've finished.' I don't know why, but that peculiar stealthy look haunted me. Why French? I kept asking myself. Why French? Arthur hasn't opened a French book for years. He doesn't even approve of the Entente. His argument was that we ought to be friends with the Germans because they are more hostile. Never mind. When Ada came back the next evening and said he was out, I came the following morning, by myself, and knocked. No one answered, and I let myself in. His bed had not been slept in. There were candles and matches all over the house. One even burnt nearly to the stick on the floor in the corner of the drawing-room. I suppose it was foolish, but I was alone, and just that, somehow, horrified me. It seemed to point to such a peculiar state of mind. I hesitated. What was the use of looking further? Yet something seemed to say to me, and it was surely providential, "Go downstairs." And there, in the breakfast-room, the first thing I saw on the table was this book. A dingy, ragged, bleared, patched up, a horrible, a loathsome little book. And I have read bits too, here and there. And beside it was my own little school dictionary. My own child's... She looked up sharply. What was that? Did anybody call? "Nobody I heard," said Danton, staring stonily round. "It may have been the passing of the wind," suggested Mr. Craik, after a pause. "Peep between the blinds, Mr. Craik. It may be poor Mr. Bethany confronting pneumonia in the porch." "There's no one there, Mrs. Lovett," said the curate, returning softly from his errand. "Please continue your narrative, Mrs. Lawford." "We are panting for the devil, my dear." "Well, I sat down, and very much against my inclination, turned over the pages. It was full of the most revolting confessions and trials, so far as I could see. In fact, I think the book was merely an amateur collection of horrors. And the faces, the portraits. Well then, can you imagine my feelings when towards the end of the book, about 30 pages from the end, I came upon this, gloating up at me from the table in my house before my very eyes." She cast a rapid glance over her shoulder, and gathering up her silk skirt, drew out, from the pocket beneath, the few crumpled pages, and passed them without a word to Danton. Lawford kept him plainly in view as, lowering his great face, he slowly stooped, and holding the loose leaves with both fat hands between his knees, stared into the portrait. Then he truculently lifted his cropped head. "What did I say?" he said. "What did I say? What did I tell old Bethany? In this very room. What'd you think of that, Mrs. Lovett, for a portrait of Arthur Lawford? What'd you make of that, Craik? Eh? Devil? Eh?" Mrs. Lovett glanced with arched eyebrows, and with her fingertips handed the sheets on to her neighbour. who gazed with a settled and mournful frown, and returned them to Sheila. She took the pages, folded them, and replaced them carefully in her pocket. She swept her hands over her skirts and turned to Danton. "You agree?" she inquired softly. "It's like?"
Like, it's the livin' livid image. The livin' image, he repeated, stretching out his arm, as he stood there that very night.
"What will you say then?" said Sheila quietly. "What will you say if I tell you that that man, Nicholas de Sabathier, has been in his grave for over 100 years?" Danton's little eyes seemed, if anything, to draw back even further into his head.
I'd say, Mrs. Lawford, if you'll excuse the word, that it might be a damn horrible coincidence. I'd go farther. An almost incredible coincidence. But if you want the sober truth, I'd say it was nothing more than a crafty, clever, abominable piece of trickery. That's what I'd say. Oh, you don't know, Mrs. Lovett. When a scamp's a scamp, he'll stop at nothing. I could tell you some tales.
"Ah, but that's not all," said Sheila, eyeing them steadfastly, one by one. "We all of us know that my husband's story was that he had gone down to Widderstone, into the churchyard, for his convalescent ramble. That story's true. We all know that he said he had a fit, a heart attack, and that a kind of stupor had come over him. I believe, on my honour, that's true too. But no one knows but he himself and Mr. Bethany and I that it was a wretched broken grave quite at the bottom of the hill that he chose for his resting place, nor, and I can't get the scene out of my head, nor that the name on that one solitary tombstone down there was this." Danton rolled his eyes.
I don't begin to follow, he said stubbornly.
"You don't mean," said Mr. Craik, who had not removed his gaze from Sheila's face, "I am not to take it that you mean, Mrs. Lawford, the other?" "Yes," said Sheila. "His." She patted her skirts. "Sabathier's." "You mean," said Mrs. Lovett crisply, "that the man in the grave is the man in the book, and that the man in the book is poor Arthur's changed face?" Sheila nodded. Danton rose cumbrously from his chair, looking beadily down on his three friends.
"Oh, but you know, it isn't right," he began. "Lord, I can see him now. Glassy, yes, that's the very word I said, glassy. It won't do, Mrs. Lawford. On my solemn honour it won't do. I don't deny it. Call it what you like. Yes, devils, if you like. But what I say as a practical man is that it's just rank. That's what it is. Bethany's had too much rope. The time's gone by for sentiment and all that foolery. Mercy's all very well, but after all, it's justice that clinches the bargain. There's only one way. We must catch him. We must lay the poor wretch by the heels before it's too late. No publicity, God bless me, no. We'd have all the rags in London on us. They'd pillory us 9 days on end. We'd never live it down. No, we must just hush it up. A home or something, an asylum. For my part," he turned like a huge toad, his chin low in his collar, "and I'd say the same if it was my own brother. And after all, he is your husband, Mrs. Lawford. I'd sooner he was in his grave. It takes two to play at that game, that's what I say. To lay himself open. I can't stand it. Honestly, I can't stand it. And yet," he jerked his chin over the peak of his collar towards the ladies, "and yet you say he's being fetched. Comes creeping home and is fetched at dark by a lady in a pony carriage. God bless me, it's rank." "What," he broke out violently again, "what was he doing there in a cemetery after dark? Do you think that beastly Frenchman would have played such a trick on Craik here? Would he have tried his little game on me? Deviltry be it, if you prefer the word, and all deference to you, Mrs. Lawford, but I know this. A couple of 100 years ago they would have burnt a man at the stake for less than a tenth of this. Ask Craik here. I don't know how, and I don't know when. His mother, I've always heard say, was a little eccentric. But the truth is he's managed by some unholy legerdemain to get the thing at his fingers' ends. That's what it is. Think of that unspeakable book, left open on the table. Look at his Ferguson game. It's our solemn duty to keep him for good and all out of mischief. It reflects all round. There's no getting out of it. We're all in it. And tar sticks. And then there's poor little Alice to consider. And you yourself, Mrs. Lawford. I wouldn't give the fellow, friend though he was in a way, it isn't safe to give him 5 minutes' freedom. We've simply got to save you from yourself, Mrs. Lawford. That's what it is, and from old-fashioned sentiment. And I only wish Bethany was here now to dispute it. He stirred himself down, as it were, into his clothes, and stood in the middle of the hearth-rug, gently oscillating, with his hands behind his back. But at some faint rumour out of the silent house his posture suddenly stiffened, and he lifted a little, with heavy, steady lids, his head. "What is the matter, Danton?" said Mr. Craik in a small voice. "Why are you listening?" "I wasn't listening," said Danton stoutly. "I was thinking." At the same moment, at the creak of a footstep on the kitchen stairs, Lawford also had drawn soundlessly back into the darkness of the empty drawing-room. "While Mr. Danton is thinking, Sheila," Mrs. Lovett was softly interposing, "do please listen a moment to me. Do you mean really that Frenchman, the one you've pocketed, is the poor creature in the grave?" "Yes, Mrs. Lawford," said Mr. Craik, putting out his face a little. "Are we to take it that you mean that?" "It's the same date, dear, the same name, even to the spelling. What possibly else can I think?" "And that poor creature in the grave actually climbed up out of the darkness and—well, what?" "I know no more than you do now, Betty. But the two faces. You must remember you haven't seen my husband since. You must remember you haven't heard the most peculiar things Arthur himself, has said to me. Things such as a wife. And not in jest, Betty, I assure you." "And Mr. Bethany?" interpolated Mr. Craik modestly, feeling his way. "Pah, Bethany, Craik, he'd back old Nick himself if he came with a good tale. We've got to act. We've got to settle his hash before he does any mischief." "Well," began Mrs. Lovett, smiling a little remorsefully beneath the arch of her raised eyebrows, "I sincerely hope you'll all forgive me. But I really am, heart and soul, with old Nick, as Mr. Danton seems on intimate terms enough to call him. Dead, he is really immensely alluring. And alive, I think, just awfully pitiful and pathetic. But if I know anything of Arthur, he won't be beaten by a Frenchman. As for just the portrait, I think, do you know, I almost prefer dark men." She glanced up at the face immediately in front of the clock. "At least," she added softly, "when they are not looking very vindictive. I suppose people are fairly often possessed, Mr. Craik? How many deadly sins are there?" "As a matter of fact, Mrs. Lovett, there are 7. But I think in this case Mrs. Lawford intends to suggest not so much that her husband is in that condition, habitual sin, you know. Grave enough, of course, I own, but that he is actually being compelled, even to the extent of a more or less complete change of physiognomy, to follow the biddings of some atrocious spiritual influence. It is no breach of confidence to say that I have myself been present at a deathbed where the struggle against what I may call the end was perfectly awful to witness. I don't profess to follow all the ramifications of the affair, but though possibly Mr. Danton may seem a little harsh, Such harshness, if I may venture to intercede, is not necessarily vindictive. And personal security is a consideration. If you only knew the awful fear, the awful uncertainty I have been in, Betty. Oh, it is worse, infinitely worse than you can possibly imagine. I have myself heard the voice speak out of him, a high, hard, nasal voice. I've seen what Mr. Danton calls the glassiness come into his face, and an expression so wild and so appallingly depraved, as it were, that I have had to hurry downstairs to hide myself from the thought. I'm willing to sacrifice everything for my own husband and for Alice, but can it be expected of me to go on harbouring—" Lawford listened on in vain for a moment. Poor Sheila, it seemed, had all but broken down. "Look here, Mrs. Lawford," began Danton huskily, "you really mustn't give way. You really mustn't. It's awful, unspeakably awful, I admit. But here we are, friends, in the midst of friends. And there's absolutely nothing—what's that? Eh? Who is it? Oh, the maid." Ada stood in the doorway looking in. "All I've come to ask, ma'am," she said in a low voice, "is, am I to stay downstairs any longer? And are you aware there's somebody in the house?" "What's that? What's that you're saying?" broke out the husky voice again. "Control yourself. Speak gently. What's that?" "Begging your pardon, sir, I'm perfectly under control. And all I say is that I can't stay any longer alone downstairs there. There's somebody in the house." A concentrated hush seemed to have fallen on the little assembly. "Somebody? But who?" said Sheila out of the silence. "You come up here, Ada, with these idle fancies. Who's in the house? There has been no knock, no footstep." "No knock, no footstep, ma'am, that I've heard. It's Dr. Ferguson, ma'am. He was here that first night, and he's been here ever since. He was here when I came on Tuesday, and he was here last night, and he's here now. I can't be deceived by my own feelings. It's not right, it's not outspoken to keep me in the dark like this. And if you have no objection, I would like to go home." Lawford, in his utter weariness, had nearly closed the door and now sat bent up on a chair, wondering vaguely when this poor play was coming to an end, longing with an intensity almost beyond endurance for the keen night air, the open sky. But still his ears drank in every tiniest sound or stir. He heard Danton's lowered voice muttering his arguments. He heard Ada quietly sniffing in the darkness of the hall. And this was his world. This was his life's panorama, creaking on at every jolt. This was the must Grisel had sent him back to, these poor fools packed together in a panic at an old stale tale. Well, they would all come out presently and cluster, and the crested cackling fellow would lead them safely away out of the haunted farmyard. He started out of his reverie at Danton's voice close at hand. "Look here, my good girl, we haven't the least intention of keeping you in the dark. If you want to leave your mistress like this in the midst of her anxieties, she says you can go, and welcome. But it's not a bit of good in the world coming up with these cock and bull stories. The truth is, your master's mad. That's the sober truth of it. Hopelessly insane, you understand. And we've got to find him. But nothing's to be said, d'you see? It's got to be done without fuss or scandal. But if there's any witness wanted, or anything of that kind, why, here you are. And," he dropped his voice to an almost inaudible hoot, "and well worth your while. You did see him, eh? Step into the trap and all that?" Ada stood silent a moment. "I don't know, sir," she began quietly, "by what right you speak to me about what you call my cock and bull stories. If the master is mad, all I can say to anybody is I'm very sorry to hear it. I came to my mistress, sir, if you please, and I prefer to take my orders from one who has a right to give them. Did I understand you to say, ma'am, that you wouldn't want me any more this evening?" Sheila had swept solemnly to the door. "Mr. Danton meant all that he said quite kindly, Ada. I can perfectly understand your feelings, perfectly.
And I'm very much obliged to you for all your kindness to me in very trying circumstances. We are all agreed. We are forced to the terrible conclusion which Mr. Danton has just expressed, and I know I can rely on your discretion. Don't stay on a moment if you really are afraid. But when you say someone, Ada, do you mean someone like you or me? Or do you mean the other? I've been sitting in the kitchen, ma'am, unable to move. I'm watched everywhere. The other evening I went into the drawing room. I was alone in the house, and I can't describe it. It wasn't dark, and yet it was all still and black, like the ruins after a fire. I don't mean I saw it, only that it was like a scene. And then the watching. I am quite aware to some it may sound all fancy, but I'm not superstitious, never was. I only mean that I can't sit alone here. I daren't, else I'm quite myself. So, if so be you don't want me any more, if I can't be of any further use to you or to Mr. Lawford, I'd prefer to go home. Very well, Ada, thank you. You can go out this way. The door was unchained and unbolted, and "Good night" said, and Sheila swept back in sombre pomp to her absorbed friends. She's quite a good creature at heart, she explained frankly, as if to disclaim any finesse, and almost quixotically loyal. But what really did she mean, do you think? She is so obstinate. That maddening "someone." How they do repeat themselves. It can't be my husband, not Dr. Ferguson, I mean. You don't suppose... Oh, surely not someone else. Again the dark silence of the house seemed to drift in on the little company. Mr. Craik cleared his throat. "I failed to catch quite all that the maid said," he murmured apologetically. "But I certainly did gather it was to some kind of emanation she was referring. And the ruin, you know. I'm not a mystic, and yet, do you know, that somehow seemed to me almost offensively suggestive of demonic influence. You don't suppose, Mrs. Lawford, and of course I wouldn't for a moment venture on such a conjecture unsupported, but even if this restless spirit, let us call it, did succeed in making a footing, it might possibly be rather in the nature of a lodging than a permanent residence. Moreover, we are, I think, bound to remember that probably in all spheres of existence like attracts like. Even the Gadarene episode seems to suggest a possible multiplication." He peered largely. "You don't suppose, Mrs. Lawford?" "I think Mr. Craik doesn't quite relish having to break the news, Sheila dear," explained Mrs. Lovett soothingly, "that perhaps Sabathier's out. Which really is quite a heavenly suggestion, for in that case your husband would be in, wouldn't he? Just our old stolid Arthur again, you know. And next, Mr. Craik is suggesting, and it certainly does seem rather fascinating, that poor Ada's got mixed up with the Frenchman's friends, or perhaps even with one of the 72 Princes Royal. I know women can't or mustn't reason, Mr. Danton, but you do, I hope, just catch the drift." Danton started. "I wasn't really listening to the girl," he explained nonchalantly, shrugging his black shoulders and pursing up his eyes. "Personally, Mrs. Lovett, I'd pack the baggage off tonight, box and all. But it's not my business." "You mustn't be depressed, must he, Mr. Craik? After all, my dear man, the business, as you call it, is not exactly entailed. But really, Sheila, I think it must be getting very late. Mr. Bethany won't come now, and the dear old thing ought certainly to have his say before we go any further, oughtn't he, Mr. Danton? So what's the use of worriting poor Ada's ghost any longer? And as for poor Arthur, I haven't the faintest desire in the world to hear the little cart drive up, simply in case it should be to leave your unfortunate husband behind it, Sheila. What it must be to be alone all night in this house with the dead and buried Frenchman's face... Well, I shudder, dear." "And yet, Mrs. Lovett," said Mr. Craik with some little show of returning bravado, "as we make our bed, you know." "But in this case, you see," she replied reflectively. "If all accounts are true, Mr. Craik, it's manifestly the wicked Frenchman who has made the bed, and Sheila who But look, Mr. Danton is fretting to get home." "If you'll all go to the door," said Danton, seizing a fleeting opportunity to raise his eyebrows more expressively even than if he had again shrugged his shoulders at Sheila, "I'll put out the light." The night air flowed into the dark house as Danton hastily groped his way out of the dining room. "There's only one thing," said Sheila slowly. "When I last saw my husband, you know, he was, I think, the least bit better. He was always stubbornly convinced it would all come right in time. That's why, I think, he's been spending his evenings away from home. But supposing it did?" "For my part," said Mrs. Lovett, breathing the faint wind that was rising out of the west, "I'd sigh, I'd rub my eyes, I'd thank God for such an exciting dream, and I'd turn comfortably over and go to sleep again. I'm all for Arthur, absolutely, back against the wall." "For my part," said Danton, looming in the dusk, "friend or no friend, I'd cut him dead. But don't fret, Mrs. Lawford. Devil or no devil, he's gone for good." "And for my part," began Mr. Craik, but the door at that moment slammed. Voices, however, broke out almost immediately in the porch. And after a hurried consultation, Lawford in his stagnant retreat heard the door softly reopen, and the striking of a match. And Mr. Craik, followed closely by Danton's great body, stole circumspectly across his dim chink, and the first adventurer went stumbling down the kitchen staircase. "I suppose," muttered Lawford, turning his head in the darkness, "they have come back to put out the kitchen gas." Danton began a busy tuneless whistle between his teeth. "Coming, Craik?" he called thickly, after a long pause. Apparently no answer had been returned to his inquiry. He waited a little longer, with legs apart and eyeballs enveloped in brooding darkness. "I'll just go and tell the ladies you're coming," he suddenly bawled down the hollow. "Do you hear, Craik? They're alone, you know." And with that he resolutely wheeled and rapidly made his way down the steps into the garden. Some few moments afterwards Mr. Craik shook himself free of the basement, hastened at a spirited trot to rejoin his companions, and in his absence of mind omitted to shut the front door. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Return by Walter de la Mare. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Corinna Schultz. Lawford sat on in the darkness, and now one sentence, and now another of their talk would repeat itself in his memory, in much the same way as one listlessly turns over an antiquated diary, to read here and there a flattened and almost meaningless sentiment. Sometimes a footstep passed echoing along the path under the trees, then his thoughts would leave him, and he would listen and listen till it had died quite out. It was all so very far away. And they too, these talkers, so very far away, as remote and yet as clear as the characters in a play when they have made their final bow and have left the curtained stage, and one is standing uncompanioned and nearly the last of the spectators, and the lights that have summoned back reality again are being extinguished. It was only by painful effort of mind that he kept recalling himself to himself, why he was here, what it all meant, that this was indeed actuality. Yet, after all, this by now was his customary loneliness. There was little else he desired for the present than the hospitality of the dark. He glanced around him in the clear, black, stirless air. Here and there, it seemed, a humped or spindled form held against all comers its passive place. Here and there a tiny faintness of light played. Night after night these chairs and tables kept their blank vigil. Why, he thought, pleased as an overtired child with the fancy, in a sense they were always alone, shut up in a kind of senselessness, just like us all. But what, he had suddenly risen from his chair to ask himself, what on earth are they alone with? No precise answer had been forthcoming to that question. But as, in turning in the doorway, he looked out into the night, flashing here and there in dark spaces of the sky above the withering apple leaves, the long dark wall and quiet untrodden road, with the tumultuous beating of the stars, one thing at least he was conscious of having learned in these last few days. He knew what kind of place he was alone in. It seemed to weave a spell over him, to call up a nostalgia he had lost all remembrance of since childhood. And that queer homesickness, at any rate, was all Sabathier's doing, he thought, smiling in his rather careworn fashion. Sabathier! It was this mystery, bereft now of all fear, and this beauty together, that made life the endless, changing and yet changeless thing it was. And yet mystery and loveliness alike were only really appreciable with one's legs, as it were, dangling down over into the grave. Just with one's lantern lit, on the edge of the whispering unknown, and a reiterated going back out of the solitude into the light and warmth, to the voices and glancing of eyes, to say good-bye. That, after all, was this life on earth for those who watched as well as acted. What if one's earthly home were empty? Still the restless fretted traveller must tarry. For the horrible worst of it is, my friend, he said, as if to some silent companion listening behind him, the worst of it is, your way was just simply, solely, suicide. What was it Herbert had called it? Yes, a cul-de-sac. Black, lofty, immensely still and old and picturesque, but none the less merely a contemptible cul-de-sac. No abiding place, scarcely even sufficing with its flagstones for a groan from the fugitive and deluded refugee. There was no peace for the wicked. The question of course then came in, was there any peace anywhere for anybody? He smiled at a sudden odd remembrance of a quiet, sardonic old aunt whom he used to stay with as a child. Children should be seen and not heard, she would say, peering at him over his favourite pudding. His eyes rested vacantly on the darkling street. He fell again into reverie, gigantically brooded over by shapes only imagination dimly conceived of, the remote alleys of his mind astir with a shadowy and ceaseless traffic which it wasn't at least this life's business to hearken after or regard. And as he stood there, in a mysteriously thronging peaceful solitude such as he had never known before, faintly out of the silence broke the sound of approaching hoofs. His heart seemed to gather itself close. A momentary blindness veiled his eyes, so wildly had his blood surged up into cheek and brain. He remained caught up, with head slightly inclined, listening as, with an interminable tardiness, measureless anguished hope died down into nothing in his mind. Cold and heavy, his heart began to beat again, as if to catch up those laggard moments. He turned with an infinite revulsion of feeling to look out on the lamps of the old fly that had drawn up at his gate. He watched, incuriously, a little old lady rather arduously alight, pause, and look up at his darkened windows, and after a momentary hesitation, and a word over her shoulder to the cabman, stoop and fumble at the iron latch. He watched her with a kind of wondering aversion, still scarcely tinged with curiosity. She had succeeded in lifting the latch and in pushing her way through, and was even now steadily advancing towards him along the tiled path. And a minute after he recognized, with the strangest reactions, the quiet old figure that had shared a sunset with him ages and ages ago, his mother's old schoolfellow, Miss Sinnet. He was already ransacking the still faintly perfumed dining room for matches, and had just succeeded in relighting the still warm lamp, when he heard her quiet step in the porch, even felt her peering in the gloom, with all her years' trickling customariness behind her, a little dubious of knocking on a wide open door. But the lamplit Lawford went out again and welcomed his visitor. 'I am alone,' he was explaining gravely. 'My wife's away, and the whole house topsy-turvy. How very, very kind of you.' The old lady was breathing a little heavily after her ascent of the steep steps, and seemed not to have noticed his outstretched hand. None the less, she followed him in, and when she was well advanced into the lighted room she sighed deeply, raised her veil over the front of her bonnet, and leisurely took out her spectacles. 'I suppose,' she was explaining in a little quiet voice, 'you are Mr. Arthur Lawford, but as I did not catch sight of a light in any of the windows, I began to fear that the cabman might have set me down at the wrong house.' She raised her head, and first through and then over her spectacles she deliberately and steadfastly regarded him. 'Yes,' she said to herself, and turned, not as it seemed entirely with satisfaction, to look for a chair. He wheeled the most comfortable up to the table. 'I have been visiting my old friend, Miss Tucker, Reverend W. Tucker's daughter. She, I knew, could give me your address, and sure enough, she did. Your road, d'ye see, was on my way home, and I determined, in spite of the hour, just to inquire. You must understand, Mr. Lawford, there was something that I rather particularly wanted to say to you. But there, you're looking sadly, sadly ill, and,' she glanced around a little inquisitively, 'I think my story had better wait for a more convenient occasion.' 'Not at all, Miss Sinnet, please not,' Lawford assured her. 'Really. I have been ill, but I'm now practically quite myself again. My wife and daughter have gone away for a few days, and I follow to morrow, so if you'll forgive such a very poor welcome, it may be my only chance. Do please let me hear.' The old lady leant back in her chair, placed her hands on its arms and softly panted, while out of the rather broad serenity of her face she sat blinking up at her companion as if after a long talk, instead of at the beginning of one. 'No,' she repeated reflectively, 'I don't like your looks at all. Yet here we are, enjoying beautiful autumn weather. Mr. Lawford, why not make use of it?' 'Oh yes,' said Lawford, 'I do. I have been making tremendous use of it.' Her eyelid flickered at his candid glance. 'And does your business permit of much walking?' 'Well, I've been malingering these last few days, idling at home. But I am usually more or less my own man, Miss Sinnet. I walk a little.' 'But not much in my direction, Mr. Lawford?' she quizzed him. 'All horrible indolence, Miss Sinnet. But I often, often think of you, and especially just lately.' 'Well now,' she wriggled round her head to get a better view of him rather stiffly seated on his chair, 'that's very peculiar, because I too have been thinking lately a great deal of you. And yet I fancy I shall succeed in mystifying you presently; not precisely of you, but of somebody else.' 'You do mystify me, somebody else,' he replied gallantly. 'And that is the story, I suppose?' 'That's the story,' repeated Miss Sinnet with some little triumph. 'Now, let me see. It was on Saturday last. Yes, Saturday evening. A wonderful sunset. Bewley Heath.' 'Oh yes, my daughter's favourite walk.' 'And your daughter's age now?' 'She's nearly 16. Alice, you know.' 'Ah, yes, Alice, to be sure. It is a beautiful walk, and if fine, I generally take mine there too. It's near, there's shade, it's very little frequented, and I can wander and muse undisturbed. And that I think is pretty well all that an old woman like me is fit for, Mr. Lawford. Nearly 16. Is it possible? Dear, dear me. But let me get on. On my way home from the Heath, you may be aware, before one reaches the road again, there's a somewhat steep ascent. I haven't the strength I had, and whether I'm fatigued or not, I have always made it a rule to rest a while on a most convenient little seat at the summit, admire the view, what I can see of it, and then make my way quietly, quietly home. On Saturday, however, and it most rarely occurs, once I remember when a very civil nursemaid was sitting with two charmingly behaved little children in the sunshine, and I heard they were my old friend Major Loder's son's children. On Saturday, as I was saying, my own particular little haunt was already occupied. She glanced back at him from out of her thoughts, as it were, by a gentleman. I say gentleman, though I must confess that his conduct, perhaps, too, a little something even in his appearance, somewhat belied the term. Anyhow, gentleman, let us call him. Lawford, all attention, nodded and encouragingly smiled. I'm not one of those tiresome suspicious people, Mr. Lawford, who distrust strangers. I have never been molested, and I have enjoyed many and many a most interesting and sometimes instructive talk with an individual whom I've never seen in my life before, and this side of the grave perhaps am never likely to see again. She lifted her head with pursed lips, and gravely, yet still flickeringly, regarded him once more. Well, I made some trifling remark, the weather, the view, what not, she explained with a little jerk of her shoulder, and to my extreme astonishment he turned and addressed me by name. Miss Sinnet. Unmistakably Sinnet. Now, perhaps, and very rightly, you won't consider that a very peculiar thing to do. But you will recollect, Mr. Lawford, that I had been sitting there a considerable time. Surely now, if you had recognized my face, you would have addressed me at once? Was he, do you think, Miss Sinnet, a little uncertain, perhaps? Never mind, never mind. Let me get on with my story first. The next thing my gentleman does is more mysterious still. His whole manner was a little peculiar, perhaps. A certain restlessness, what, in fact, one might be almost tempted to call a certain furtiveness of behaviour. Never mind. What he does next is to ask me a riddle. Perhaps you won't think that was peculiar either. What was the riddle? Smiled Lawford. Why, to be sure, to guess his name. Simply guided, so I surmised, by some very faint resemblance in his face to his mother, who was, he assured me, an old schoolfellow of mine at Brighton. I thought and thought. I confess the adventure was beginning to be a little perplexing. But, of course, very, very few of my old schoolfellows remain distinctly in my memory now, and I fear that grows more treacherous the longer I live. Their faces as girls are clear enough, but later in life most of them drifted out of sight. Many, alas, are dead. And, well, at last I narrowed my man down to one. And who now do you suppose that was? Lawford sustained an expression of abysmal mystification. Do tell me. Who? Your own poor dear mother, Mr. Lawford. He said so? Oh, no, no, said the old lady with some vexation, closing her eyes. I said so. He asked me to guess. And I guessed Mary Lawford. Now do you see? Yes, yes. But was he like her, Miss Sinnet? That was really very, very extraordinary. Did you see any likeness in his face? Miss Sinnet very deliberately took her spectacles out of their case again. Now, see here, sir. This is being practical, isn't it? I'm just going to take a leisurely glance at yours. But you mustn't let me forget the time. You must look after the time for me. It's about 9:15, said Lawford, having glanced first at the stopped clock on the chimney-piece and then at his watch. He then sat quite still and endeavoured to sit at ease, while the old lady lifted her bonneted head and ever so gravely and benignly
surveyed him. 'Huh,' she said at last. 'There's no mistaking you. It's Mary's chin, and Mary's brow, with just a little something perhaps of her dreamy eye. But you haven't all her looks, Mr Lawford, by any manner of means. She was a very beautiful girl, and so vivacious, so fanciful. It was, I suppose, the foreign strain showing itself. Even marriage did not quite succeed in spoiling her.' 'The foreign strain?' Lawford glanced with a kind of fleeting fixity at the quiet old figure. 'The foreign strain?' 'Your mother's maiden name, my dear Mr Lawford—surely memory does not deceive me in that—was Van der Gucht. That, I believe, is a foreign name.' 'Ah, yes,' said Lawford, his rising thoughts sinking quietly to rest again. 'Van der Gucht, of course. How stupid of me. As a matter of fact, your mother was very proud of her Dutch blood. But there,' she flung out little fin-like sleeves, 'if you don't let me keep to my story, I shall go back as uneasy as I came. And you didn't,' she added even more fretfully, 'you didn't tell me the time.' Lawford stared at his watch again for some few moments without replying. 'It's a few minutes to 10,' he said at last. 'Dear me, and I'm keeping the cabman. I must hurry on. Well, now, I put it to you. You shall be my father confessor, though I detest the idea in real life. Was I wrong? Was I justified in professing to the poor fellow that I detected a likeness, when there was extremely little likeness there?' 'What? None at all?' cried Lawford. 'Not the faintest trace?' 'My dear good Mr Lawford,' she expostulated, patting her lap, 'there's very little more than a trace of my dear beautiful Mary in you, her own son. How could there be? How could you expect it in him, a complete stranger? No, it was nothing but my own foolish kindliness. It might have been Mary's son for all that I could recollect. I haven't for years, please remember, had the pleasure of receiving a visit from you. I am firmly of the opinion that I was justified. My motive was entirely benevolent. And then, to my positive amazement—well, I won't say hard things of the absent, but he suddenly turns round on me with a "Thank you, Miss Bennett." Bennett! Hark ye, perhaps you won't agree that I had any justification in being vexed and affronted at that. 'I think, Miss Sinnet,' said Lawford solemnly, 'that you were perfectly justified. Oh, perfectly. I wonder even you had the patience to give the real Arthur Lawford a chance to ask your forgiveness for the stranger.' 'Well, candidly,' said Miss Sinnet severely, 'I was very much scandalised. And I shouldn't be here now telling you my story if it hadn't been for your mother.' 'My mother!' The old lady rather grimly enjoyed his confusion. 'Yes, Mr Lawford, your mother. I don't know why. Something in his manner, something in his face, so dejected, so unhappy, so—if it is not uncharitableness to say it—so wild. It has haunted me. I haven't been able to put the matter out of my mind. I have lain awake in my bed thinking of him. Why did he speak to me, I keep asking myself. Why did he play me so very aimless a trick? How had he learned my name? Why was he sitting there so solitary and so dejected? And worse even than that, what has become of him? A little more patience, a little more charity perhaps, what might I not have done for him? The whole thing has harassed and distressed me more than I can say. Would you believe it? I have actually twice, and on one occasion 3 times in a day, made my way to the seat, hoping to see him there. And I am not so young as I was. And then, as I say, to crown all, I had a most remarkable dream about your mother. But that's my own affair. Elderly people like me are used—well, perhaps I won't say used. We're not surprised or disturbed by visits from those who have gone before. We live, in a sense, among the tombs, though I would not have you fancy it's in any way a morbid or unhappy life to lead. We don't talk about it. Certainly not to young people. Let them enjoy their Eden while they can. Though there's plenty of apples, I fear, on the tree yet, Mr Lawford.' She leaned forward and whispered it with a big simple smile. 'We don't even discuss it much among ourselves. But as one gets nearer and nearer to the wicket gate there's other company around one than you'll find in the Directory. And that is why I have just come on here to-night. Very probably my errand may seem to have no meaning for you. You look ill, but you don't appear to be in any great trouble or adversity, as I feared in my—well, there, as I feared you might be. I must say, though, it seems a terribly empty house. And no lights, too.' She slowly, with a little trembling nodding of her bonnet, turned her head and glanced quietly, fixedly, and unflinchingly out of the half-open door. 'But that's not my affair.' And again she looked at him for a little while. Then she stooped forward and touched him kindly and trustingly on the knee. 'Trouble or no trouble,' she said, 'it's never too late to remind a man of his mother. And I'm sure, Mr Lawford, I'm very glad to hear you are struggling up out of your illness again. We must keep a brave heart, 40 or 70, whichever we may be. While the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them. Though they have not come to me even yet, and I trust from the bottom of my heart not to you.' She looked at him without a trace of emotion or constraint in her large quiet face, and their eyes met for a moment in that brief, fixed, baffling fashion that seems to prove that mankind is after all but a dumb masked creature saddled with the vain illusion of speech. 'And now that I've eased my conscience,' said the old lady, pulling down her veil, 'I must beg pardon for intruding at such an hour of the evening. And may I have your arm down those dreadful steps? Really, Mr Lawford, judging from the houses they erect for us, the builders must have a very peculiar notion of mankind. Is the fly still there? I expressly told the man to wait. And what I am going to do if—' 'He's there,' Lawford reassured her, craning his neck in their slow progress to catch a peep into the quiet road. And like a flock of birds scared by a chance comer at their feeding in some deserted field, a whirring cloud of memories swept softly up in his mind, memories whose import he made no effort to discover. None the less, the leisurely descent became in their company something of a real experience, even in such a brimming week. 'I hope some day you will really tell me your dream,' he said, pushing the old lady's silk skirts in after her as she slowly climbed into the carriage. 'Ah, my dear Lawford, when you are my age,' she called back to him, groping her way into the rather musty gloom, 'you'll dream such dreams for yourself. Life's not what's just the fashion. And there are queerer things to be seen and heard just quietly in one's solitude than this busy life gives us time to discover. But as for my mystifying Bewley acquaintance, I confess I cannot make head or tail of him.' 'Was he—' said Lawford rather vaguely, looking up into the dim white face that, with its plumes, filled nearly the whole carriage window. 'Was his face very unpleasing?' She raised a gloved hand. 'It has haunted me, Mr Lawford. It's conflict. Poor fellow. I hope, I do hope, he faced his trouble out. But I shall never see him again.' He squeezed the trembling, kindly old hand. 'I bet, Miss Sinnet,' he said earnestly, 'even your having thought kindly of the poor beggar eased his mind, whoever he may have been. I assure you of that.' 'Ay, but I did more than think,' replied the old lady with a chuckle that might have seemed even a little derisive if it had not been so profoundly magnanimous. He watched the old black fly roll slowly off, and still smiling at Miss Sinnet's inscrutable finesse, went back into the house. 'And now, my friend,' he said, addressing peacefully the thronging darkness, The time's nearly up for me to go too.' He had made up his mind. Or rather, it seemed as if in the unregarded silences of this last long talk his mind had made up itself. Only among impossibilities had he the shadow of a choice. In this old haunted house, amid this shallow turmoil, no practicable clue could show itself of a way out. He would go away for a while. He left the door ajar behind him for the moments still left, and stood for a while thinking. Then, lamp in hand, he descended into the breakfast room for pen, ink, and paper. He sat for some time in that underground calm, nibbling his pen like a harassed and self-conscious schoolboy. At last he began. 'My dear Sheila, I must tell you, to begin with, that the change has now all passed away. I am, as near as man can be, completely myself again. And next, that I overheard all that was said to night in the dining room. I'm sorry for listening, but it's no good going over all that now. Here I am, and as you said, for Alice's sake, we must make the best of it. I am going away for a while, to get, if I can, a chance to quiet down. I suppose every one comes sooner or later to a time in life when there is nothing else to be done but just shut one's eyes and blunder on. And that's all I can do now, blunder on.' He paused, and suddenly, at the echo of the words in his mind, a revulsion of feeling, shame and hatred of himself, surged up, and he tore his letter into tiny pieces. Once more he began. 'My dear Sheila,' dropped his pen, sat on for a long time, cold and inert, harbouring almost unendurably a pitiful, hopeless longing. He would write to Grisel another day. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers pressed against his eyelids, and clearer than those which myriad-hued reality can ever present, pictures of the imagination swam up before his eyes. It seemed, indeed, that even now some ghost, some revenant of himself, was sitting there in the old green churchyard, roofed only with 1,000 stars. The breath of darkness stirred softly on his cheek. Some little scampering shape slipped by. A bird on high cried weirdly, solemnly over the globe. He shuddered faintly and looked out again into the small lamplit room. Here, too, was quite as inexplicable a coming and going. A fly was walking on the table beneath his eyes, with the uneasy gait of one that has outlived his hour and most of his companions. Mice were scampering and shrieking in the empty kitchen. And all about him, in the viewless air, the phantoms of another life passed by, unmindful of his motionless body. He fell into a lethargy of the senses, and only gradually became aware after a while of the strange long-drawn sigh of rain at the window. He rose and opened it. The night air flowed in, chilled with its waters and faintly fragrant of the dust. It soothed away all thought for a while. He turned back to his chair. He would wait until the rain had lulled before starting. A little before midnight the door was softly and with extreme care pushed open, and Mr Bethany's old face, with an intense and sharpened scrutiny, looked in on the lamplit room. And as if still intent on the least sound within the empty walls around him, he came near, and stooping across the table, stared through his spectacles at the sidelong face of his friend, so still, with hands so lightly laid on the arms of his chair that the old man had need to watch closely to detect in his heavy slumber the slow measured rise and fall of his breast. He turned wearily away, muttering a little, between an immeasurable relief and a now almost intolerable medley of vexations. What was this monstrous web of Craik's? What had the creature been nodding and ducketing about? Those whisperings, that tattling. And what, in the end, when you were old and sour and out-strategied, what was the end to be of this urgent dream called life?
He sat quietly down and drew his hands over his face, pushed his lean, knotted fingers up under his spectacles, then sat blinking, and softly, slowly deciphered the solitary "My dear Sheila" on Lawford's notepaper. 'Huh,' he muttered, and looked up again at the dark, still eyelids that, in the strange torpor of sleep, might yet be dimly conveying to the dreaming brain behind them some hint of his presence. 'I wish to goodness, you wonderful old creature,' he muttered, wagging his head, 'I wish to goodness you'd wake up.' For some time he sat on, listening to the still soft downpour on the fading leaves. 'They don't come to me,' he said softly again, with a tiny smile on his old face. 'It's that old medieval Craik, with a face like last year's rookery.' And again he sat, with head a little sidelong, listening now to the infinitesimal sounds of life without, now to the thoughts within, and ever and again he gazed steadfastly on Lawford. At last, it seemed in the haunted quietness, other thoughts came to him. A cloud, as it were, of youth drew over the wrinkled skin, composed the bird-like keenness. His head nodded. Once, like Lawford in the darkness at Widderstone, he glanced up sharply across the lamplight at his phantasmagorical shadowy companion, heard the steady surge of multitudinous raindrops, like the roar of Time's winged chariot hurrying near. Then he too, with spectacles awry, bobbed on in his chair, a weary old sentinel on the outskirts of his friend's denuded battlefield. End of chapter 23. End of The Return by Walter de la Mare.